Moving into our third hour, my guest, Doug Dietrich. Secrets revealed on this program, history rewritten, the grimmer side of history, and the space program. 50 years ago, Soviet Russia celebrated the first man in orbit. His name was Yuri Gagarin. Stamps were printed. His face was all over the place, but was he really the first man in space? The question we ask tonight. Doug Dietrich has done a great job of giving us the history of the space programs from every angle. From the sound barrier being broken by the Japanese, several other stories that he has and he's trying to tell us about. And many people calling and saying that Doug is right on. And tonight, taking your calls, too. Have any questions for Doug? 503-417-7575 or 1-800-827-0750. He'll take your questions. But right now, what we're going to do is I'm going to bring Doug on.
Great.
Doug, we were talking earlier about, you made a statement, and somebody actually said in the chat room that it was a very clever way of putting it, that both the American space program and the Soviet space program threw bodies at their problems.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in the Soviet case, they were treating space as a frontier, and to them this was an effort at colonization. They really wanted to put a Lunargrad, a city on the moon. They really wanted a Mirograd, an orbital city. So to them, they wanted this to be like another Siberia, someplace where they could send their best and their brightest instead of their criminals, as they did into the East. But in terms of the Americans, what they had going on instead was Project Odysseus, and that was the reserve astronaut program. And the reserve astronaut program had made more launches than any of the original 7 of Mercury, than any of the new 9 that would later land on the moon with 12 astronauts. And the reserve program was unknown even to the families of these astronauts. The families of these astronauts literally thought that these astronauts sat around all day warming the bench. But the truth was they had more time in space logged in than any of the famous celebrity astronauts. And so what the military was doing was it was waging a military war to destroy the Soviet colonization program. So all of the death screams, all of the murmurs and last gasps that you will hear will be that of murdered cosmonauts, because reserve astronauts in the old Project Odysseus were doing such things as taking the Dinosaur, which was the military version of the space shuttle, literally being able to maneuver in that vacuum environment above the primitive Soviet capsules and drop literally thousands of ball bearings in their orbital path, which the Soviets could never turn their capsules in time. And in the vacuum of space, just them on such a violently, incredibly fast trajectory would carry them through this minefield of ball bearings and rip their capsules to shreds. And they would disintegrate and their bodies would implode in the vacuum. And you would hear their screams while this was occurring. And so the Italian brothers that we're speaking of were recording just maybe scores out of what might have amounted to hundreds of deaths. And today it's referred to by people in the know, people in the black budget. When you take a look at the American economic pie graph, and you see half of it almost is for military, the other half basically is for health care, and then there's these little slices for education and whatnot. It's really pie a la mode. And that real black, gloppy, black budget that's on top of it, that black ball of ice cream, is going into projects such as this, these secret covert space programs. And the black budget at that time of these astronauts that were killing the Soviet attempt at colonization was a military program. But the public program that everyone is aware of, the reason we never went anywhere with it was because the American government never viewed it as a colonization program. To them, it was literally based on the Jack Parsons model and exercise in occult alchemy. They simply wanted to, and I saw the records concerning this, where Jack Parsons stated to presidents who were Freemasons, such as Eisenhower and Truman and all the rest of these guys. Basically, it was post-Truman. It was Eisenhower and after, all the way up into, the point he died. Was in that mercury fulminate explosion after he sold a bunch of secrets to Israel. But the point was he was saying things like, we've got to send these capsules up to the moon, and the bits of the rockets that we're disposing of, rather than sending it into orbit, we'll send it into the sun. Then we'll have a marriage of the sun and the moon, and we'll have these launches in these particular astrological gates when these gates are open, and they all took place under these various kind of astrological gates that other people have made recognition of, specifically Hoagland and whatnot. He gets a little too far out with his hyperdimensional hokum, but he basically has it right. This is a bunch of fraternity boys who are taking advantage of this program to launch an exercise in alchemy that they thought would somehow transform America into this supreme nation on Earth. And so they're not thinking like you and I. They're not thinking along these practical terms. But the people who are, they have another term for the troposphere, the stratosphere. They have something they call the detritosphere. And the detritosphere surrounding our Earth has all of those fragments of ball bearings and destroyed capsules.
And dead astronauts, right?
And cosmonauts' bodies.
Oh, my God.
Orbiting the Earth permanently. And that's why it's still a military program to try and catalog all of that orbiting debris, because space is becoming so polluted, we can never leave the Earth through that shield of detritosphere because of any bit of flotsam and jetsam that's that violent, that at those levels will violently tear through the skin of a spaceship.
It's probably why they tell you when they take you up to like the space station, they tell people you can't go up there, and if you see anything, you can't tell anybody what's up there. So what I want to do now, Doug, is I want to play a first one. What you're about to hear, this is recorded by the Giudica Cordiglia brothers, amateur ham radio operators who hacked into NASA's radio frequencies and also into the Soviet space program's frequencies. What you're about to hear is an alarm. You'll be hearing an alarm going off in a capsule. This is recorded, and you'll be hearing the labored breathing of an astronaut or a cosmonaut, and then you'll hear the breathing stop. Here's that recording now. That's supposed to be a recording of a colleague of the real first astronaut in space, Vladimir Ilyushin, who said that a friend of his that went before him on February 16th of 1961 lost consciousness in his spacecraft and had a heart attack while in space.
Amazing.
And we do have the recording. They also have the sound of the heart giving out as well. Let's listen to that. That was the heart, and then you hear the alarm going right afterwards. See, what happened is they monitored the cosmonauts, and then when the vitals started to fall below levels, the alarms would go off. So you were hearing the heart kicking, the alarm going off. So it's kind of in reverse, the alarm going off, and then the final breaths of the cosmonaut. And these are very disturbing and frantic signals from space. I mean, these are things that aren't normally heard, especially on radio.
Yes. Yeah.
So, any opinions on those so far, Doug?
Pretty much what I said before, that I hope we can all appreciate this in terms of a human effort and part of the human struggle, but it definitely also explains why the shuttles go up so low, why we're basically stuck in low Earth orbit, and a lot of it has to do with the debris produced by this war in space. So believe me when I say that the Cold War was a third world war, that combined with the kind of struggles that were going on Earth in Vietnam and in Korea, there's no other way you could look at it otherwise. I mean, just to give you an example, U.S. aircraft taken off from aircraft carriers over North Vietnam, they lost over 1,000 carrier-based planes shot down over Vietnam. That's over 40 squadrons of carrier aircraft. That's far larger than any carrier-to-carrier battles in World War II in terms of pilot losses. How could we not call this a third world war? And this was simply another front of it, the high front, the battle for orbit, And the Americans won, and it was one of the reasons for the death knell of the Soviet Union, because by winning, we were able to threaten the application, as fallacious as the science may have been behind it, but we were able to threaten the application of a Star Wars defense system.
Kind of explains why the Russians never were number 2 on the moon. I always question that. I always say to myself, well, if we made it to the moon, why did Russia decide not to go? And it would be because of the fact that they had to get out of the way of those the pollutants that were left behind when the war was going on between the astronauts and the pre-space program. So this is the war in heaven prior to the big war in heaven with the space weaponry and the military-industrial complex gone crazy. I mean, you talked last time on this program about space platforms being placed strategically in the sky, the Mir projects of several Mirs in the sky from Russia, right, and then the counterbalance of our space platforms, which are responsible for many of the UFO sightings we're seeing now. My guest is Doug Dietrich here on Ground Zero. We are getting into the real meat of what the subject is tonight. Yuri Gagarin was the first alleged human to leave the bounds of Earth and orbit the Earth. It's 50 years ago this week it happened. Doug Dietrich is giving us some background, and we're listening to some recorded material from the Giudica Cordiglia brothers, amateur ham radio operators who actually tapped into astronauts who, according to Doug Dietrich, were sabotaged by American rockets and space planes. 503-417